What are some of the greatest things about our country today that you recognize and you see people in America maybe take for granted?
The freedom of speech,
Mm-hmm.
the freedom of speech,
Right.
the freedom to think for yourself. When I think back to my culture and what has become of my culture, it's so tragic because people have to become duplicitous in order to survive. They have to become another person that they are not. They're not free to be themselves. They're not free to think. They're not free to speak their mind. And that is one of the greatest oppressions the human can suffer, is to not be yourself.
Right.
And we are free to do that here in this country.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
All right, welcome to another edition of American Potential. Appreciate you joining us. You know, America is an amazing place. It's a very special place. And those of us who've lived here a long time sometimes take it for granted. And we need to be reminded of how great it is. You know, many Americans just take liberty and freedom for granted. In fact, I'd say most Americans wouldn't give a second thought when they turn on a water faucet or turn on a light switch, because running water and electricity is always there. But you know, in a socialist country, that's a luxury. And being able to go to the grocery store and buy as much food as you need, that's not the norm in other places in America, but we take it for granted in America. Food ration cards and being sent to prison for having more food than you were allowed was a reality in that today's guest survived in Cuba. For her family, life wasn't about living, but just about surviving in a socialist country. Her father, who is a pastor, was sent to a maximum security prison for 4 years for preaching the gospel. But that didn't stop him from sharing his faith to the other inmates. And because freedom and liberty can't be extinguished in the hearts of those who yearn for it, no matter how terrible a despot or a dictator is. Now, because her father was in prison, this meant her family was an outcast and the community wouldn't help them. But with help from a well-known person, her father was released from prison, but exiled from their home country. This allowed them to seek asylum in America. This is an important story for every American to hear and remember this incredible blessing of freedom and liberty that we have. Breathe it in, enjoy it, savor it, and defend it. Because our guest has experienced socialism, she believes it's important for her friends, neighbors, and fellow citizens to be involved in the political process. And that is why she is educating her community to do so. I want to welcome Grace Cabrera, a lover of freedom, liberty, and a lover of America, to the show. Hi, Grace. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
You know, I'm doing awesome. I really think people take it for granted when, you know, I was born in America, I've lived here my whole life. I love America. I see the blessings. I value the Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all those things. But I do think that Americans who were born here, we just take that stuff for granted. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And you being born in Cuba, I'm sure it's a little more fresh in your mind how bad it can be without those blessings.
It definitely is. And that was such a great introduction. I don't think I could have said it better. I love the fervor in it, and it reflects how I feel. I was born in Cuba. My parents were born in Cuba as well, and I didn't know any better the whole time that I lived there. I didn't realize how oppressed I was. I knew I was oppressed, but I didn't realize the level of oppression until I finally got to escape and come to a country like this one.
So I think that it's interesting that you say you didn't know how oppressed you were. And I think, it's like the reverse of what happens in America. Sometimes we don't know how blessed we are because we take it for granted. It's what we're used to. But you're saying that, when you were in Cuba, that's what you were used to. You didn't know what life would be like somewhere else. That's interesting. I guess I'd never thought about it that way before. Any thoughts on that and the comparison there?
Well, when you're born in a place that is closed off to the rest of the world and the information that comes through is heavily censored and modified before it gets to you, then it makes it very difficult to really know what's out there. In Cuba, we were told that the rest of the world was in shambles and there was war everywhere and violence everywhere. And it was just terrible. While in my daily life, I saw even worse things, but I didn't have a way to compare it until after I came here. In Cuba, there are no classes. Everyone is under the same oppression, under the same necessities, under the same starvation, the lack of opportunities. It doesn't matter whether you study hard. There is no advancement. So there is no motivation to do much with your life. And that makes it very difficult for the youth. Yeah.
Well, they talk about socialism being the equal sharing of misery. And it sounds like that's really what it was. What was your everyday, ordinary day like for you in Cuba?
Well, since I was so young, I had to go to school every day. My breakfast consisted of the rationed roll of bread every day that we had bought the previous day. Even though the food was already rationed, my mom had to ration even more in order for us to be able to have breakfast or have a little bit of food for the next day. That was the constant struggle. The everyday worry is, what are you going to eat today? And that's what you're thinking about constantly. And once I would get to school, of course, we were heavily indoctrinated. We were told that the United States was going to attack at any moment. I see how in the schools in the United States there are tornado drills or fire drills on a regular basis. In Cuba, we didn't have those. What we had were war drills. So they're constantly scaring you into submission. If you are scared of something bigger, then you don't focus so much on what's in front of you and the abuse that you are suffering every day.
Wow, that's, again, it's just something that's totally foreign to most people who live in the United States and never grew up under a system like you did. And you were 11, is that right, when you came to the United States?
Yes.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about your dad. What was he like while you were growing up?
My dad was kind of fearless, which is strange to see in places like that.
Yeah, right.
He spoke his mind, which can easily get you in trouble. Even complaining about the current situation can get you into trouble. But my dad got saved when before I was born, and eventually he became a youth pastor, and he took all that energy he had and started preaching all over the place. He became a youth pastor and started going into the intricate places in that side of the country, into the mountains to preach where there had never been the word of God. Those places, the entire country really, because when Fidel Castro first came in, he did away with all religions. He did away with all the churches, turned many churches into military bases. So many kids of my generation had no idea what the concept of religion was at all, what the concept of God was. The entire country was atheist, and it seems kind of surreal, but no one had ever heard of those things. No one had ever heard of Christmas, even though before the revolution it was part of our culture. And having people come and tell you about God and about a purpose, it can be a dangerous thing for any communist regime, because when you have a faith that individualizes you, you lose the fear of men, and instead you fear God. When you do that, obviously, that makes you a dangerous person in a country like that.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, so well put. And, these countries like Cuba are about the collective and about power and the government controlling and keeping power over people. And you talk about individuals. And, of course, that's what America is based on, the rights of individuals, that each of us have God-given rights, as our Declaration of Independence states. So it is really the antithesis to socialist countries and what's going on there. So your dad, what a fearless man. So what was the government's reaction to your dad being out preaching?
Definitely did not go without consequences. We were constantly receiving visits from the local officials. They would turn our house upside down, take whatever they wanted, give warnings to my dad. There were a couple of times when my dad was exiled from our town for a full year, and we had to travel, which was very difficult to do in Cuba, in order to see him. So it was constant stress. Every time we heard engines coming towards our house, we would obviously become very scared, run to our parents, and it was a constant state of fear for all of us, for everyone in the island, because everyone knows better. There are just some things you cannot say. There are some things you cannot do. And this went on until eventually my dad was accused of rebellion against the government when I was 6 years old. They took him away. I remember the night that they showed up at our house. They turned the house upside down as usual, but this time they did take him, and we were very scared. My mother was afraid because she was left with 3 children on her own. One of them was 21 days old, my youngest brother. And the trials started for my dad, but they never ended. They just put him in a maximum security prison and sentenced him 8 to 20 plus years for rebellion against the government.
And the rebellion was preaching the gospel? Was that the rebellion?
Of course, they don't have that in writing.
Sure.
But their purpose is to turn people like my dad into common criminals.
Yeah.
So they come up with false charges like he was gathering people in the mountains to go against the revolution. And they find false witnesses to testify. Right. But even that is unnecessary. Sometimes they just do whatever they want because they have all the power there.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I mean, your dad, what an amazing spirit he had through this time, for sure. Because most people, when they get confronted with that, and we see it here, I mean, we see it with people who get pushback or criticized a little bit, and they're willing to back off because they don't want somebody, maybe somebody even on social media, to criticize them. Your dad pushed forward with what he believed was right, even in the face of the government coming in and imprisoning him. I mean, that takes courage beyond courage. I mean, your dad was a very courageous man for being able to do this, as is, Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the old Soviet Union, or anyone who stands up against these tyrannical despots around the world.
I can confidently say that my dad is my hero.
Yeah.
I really admire everything that I saw of him. When he was imprisoned, these types of prison were designed by the Soviets, and they were designed to break a man after 2 years. And everything was carefully selected. The colors of the walls, the lack of windows, the lack of sunlight. The lights were turned off, were on 24/7. So they didn't have a notion of day and night for many hours. And they had 24 people together in a cell for most of the floors. So they put him in with some of the worst murderers, rapists, some of the worst of the society over there. And my dad did what he knew how to do. He started talking to them about God, and eventually they were having Sunday services after a few years.
But the government loves that. Great. Well, that's
every time. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Every time they saw that this was happening, they kept trying to find worse and worse cells to put him into, but the same thing would continue to happen. A lot more people would become saved. There were some prisoners who were sent to hurt my dad physically or to steal from him, and a lot of them repented and started protecting him from others.
Wow. That's incredible. So how did, I just have to, I guess, ask this question too. Like, how did your family feel going through this? Because, it would have been easier in some ways to just say, you know what, we don't want this fight. I mean, I realize that would have been turning your back on your faith and God and things like that. And that's probably not something that wasn't considered, but a lot of people would consider that. I mean, this made life much more difficult, certainly for your dad, but also for you, for your family. I would assume it got far worse for you once your dad was in prison.
It really did. And during that time, it was also, Cuba was already in dire conditions, but the Soviet Union fell in the late 80s, and Cuba was a type of parasite to the Soviet Union until it fell. And once they lost that support, things became even worse for the country. So it was very difficult to find food or to find anything at all. And the government made it worse by imposing insane regulations on the people, such as not being able to carry more than 4 pounds of anything edible, or you'd go to prison, because then that would be considered hoarding, and only the government was allowed to have food and sell. So it was very difficult times. My mom had to risk going to prison by picking up coffee in the mountains and selling it in the capital in Havana. And those trips were very difficult as well. If she would have been caught, she would have gone to prison as well. But that was the only way she could survive and be able to feed us.
This is going to be a personal rant, so disregard this, Grace, for a minute. But if you're listening to this as an American right now, I mean, are you hearing this? This is how good you have it. For people who want to criticize the United States, and, the United States is not perfect by any means, but are you listening to what people around the world go through? And we complain if our cell phone doesn't work, or if we don't have, unlimited minutes on our calling plan. This is truly what other people around the world go through. To this day, there are people who live this kind of a life around the world. And so Americans have to be, take a moment to sit and think about this and pause. Grace, so you're a young girl. It sounds like from like 6 until you were 11 and left. This has to be a very difficult time for you, right? I'm looking at this through an adult's eyes, and you can rationalize it. But to a kid, it must have been really very difficult to understand this and what your dad was going through and why he was going through it. How did that shape you, I guess, as a person, your faith? I'd love to hear that.
Sure. I had to grow up very quickly. I had to be very conscious of my mom's efforts. I had to help take care of my baby brother and make sure that I wasn't wasting anything. Everything was extremely valuable. Every little thing had to be taken care of because you had no idea if you were going to be able to get anything at all. A cup, a spoon, a clothes, everything was extremely precious. And then seeing my mom go through all that work, coming home scratched up from the woods because she had to cook with wood every single day. It was hard. I missed my dad, and it was just a terrible situation. But we had to heavily rely on God and the miracles. Just when we were at the end of our rope, someone would come through and help us. But we just had to have a lot of faith through that. Wow. Those times. I'm sure your faith grew tremendously through that time, because that's when people's faith, I think, does grow when they go through difficult situations like that. That's really an incredible story. Now, so your father was in prison, never stopped sharing his faith, as you said, throughout that, which is just amazing. Pope John Paul II played a role in your family's story. Tell me about that. Well, during 4 years of my dad's imprisonment, my mother was taking information from other political prisoners in my dad's case and taking it to the embassies, the European embassies in Havana. That information made it to human rights organizations around the world, and eventually it made it to the Pope. In 98, when the Pope went to Cuba, he had a list of 300 political prisoners whose cases he had reviewed, and he was asking for the freedom of those 300 political prisoners. Out of those 300, only 150 were released. And the condition was that they leave the country immediately. And my dad was one of them.
Wow. Yeah. So he was released and allowed to get to come to the United States and ask for political asylum here. Is that right?
Yes. Since several countries were aware of this list, several countries had offered asylum, and one of them was the U.S. So we chose to come to the U.S.
Yeah. So I would imagine, so what was the biggest shock when you came to America? I've heard immigrants talk about this a lot, and I always love these stories. Like sometimes they'll say, I went into a Walmart and I just couldn't believe. And again, that's something Americans take for granted every day. I mean, we just walk into a Walmart and you expect everything to be on the shelves. But people see that and they go, there wasn't one type of, of milk. There were all kinds of types of milk. I mean, what were some of the biggest shocks to you when you first came to the United States?
I will do my best to relate the feelings, but it's still not enough. I was in awe of, first, there was electricity everywhere. There were standing structures that were not falling apart. There were actual streets, not gravel roads. And I mean, that to me was beautiful. when I first came here, even though I couldn't figure out how to work the faucets with the. But just having running water all the time, electricity was a huge shock.
Yeah.
And having hot and cold water was a luxury to us.
Wow. Yeah. And again, all of those, Grace, are things that we do every single day. We do those things and we don't think a thing about it in America.
Yes, I am extremely grateful. There is no way I can ever be depressed, because if I go back to where I came from and remember where I was, I have to be grateful.
Right.
I just have to be grateful to be alive, and not only to be alive, but to be here.
Yeah. Yeah. America, truly, it's such an extraordinary place to be able to live. What are some of the greatest things about our country today that you recognize and you see people in America maybe take for granted?
The freedom of speech, the freedom of speech,
Right.
the freedom to think for yourself. When I think back to my culture and what has become of my culture, it's so tragic, because people have to become duplicitous in order to survive. They have to become another person that they are not. They're not free to be themselves. They're not free to think. They're not free to speak their mind. And that is one of the greatest oppressions the human can suffer, is to not be yourself.
Right.
And we are free to do that here in this country.
Yeah, it's that individualism, right, that our founding documents lay out and that are so wonderful to our system. When you came to the United States, your family was offered assistance. What did your dad say about that?
My dad, I'm really grateful to have had him as a father, because he really taught me character. My father was offered 6 months of Medicaid, of rent paid, plus cash, plus food stamp. And after 1 month, he refused it all, and he got a job. And even though we struggled a little bit after that, of course, nothing compared to Cuba. But after having our carts filled with food every single time we went to the grocery store, and having everything we could have possibly wanted to eat, which to us was the most important thing at the time, we asked him, why can't we do that anymore? Why are we limiting ourselves now? And he told us that we came to this country to give, not to take away, and that we should be happy and grateful just to be able to be allowed here. Wow.
Man, that's well, first of all, what a great man, your father. What a great example he has been to you, and I'm sure to your whole family. That's an incredible story. If you haven't done it already, you should write a book about your dad and your experience. I'm just telling you, seems like a big undertaking, but you should do it, because I'd read the book. I'd buy it and I'd read it. I can tell you. You ran, now you feel like giving back, right, to America, and you ran for city council. Unfortunately, you lost. Why was it important for you to take that step in running for an elected position in the United States?
Because I see where things are heading. I see where government is overstepping, and where they're trying to become they're trying to become Big Brother in many ways, and they want to make people dependent. No country that has ever made people dependent on them has ever been financially successful. On the contrary, they have created a lot more poverty, and there's bubbles inside the U.S. that have demonstrated that. The more people depend on you, the more poverty you create. I'm in the business of empowering people, of empowering individuals and their creativity and their talent, and to see what their full potential is, just by giving them opportunities. All we needed when we came to this country was an opportunity, and we took it. We were so shocked to see that in this country there were homeless people, that there was so much poverty, because we came with $5 here, and we relied on community. And that's more of what we need. We really just need community and relationships. We don't need government handouts. That does not help, and it doesn't help in the long term. So when I see what is happening here, how the branches of government are growing, how the local government departments want to expand to take over housing and healthcare and welfare and all these things, it's such a dangerous ideology. I've seen it. That's what made Cuba what it is today, is government promises. You can never trust those.
Yeah. Wow. What an amazing story. You also helped gather a group of people to go through a grassroots leadership academy through Americans for Prosperity Foundation. Why was that important to you?
Because once again, empowerment. I want people to take advantage of being in a place where they can still have their voice heard. I want them to feel represented and to use the opportunities to affect government and leadership in their communities in a way that I never could have in my country. Yeah.
What an amazing story, Grace. I'm telling you, we'll have to have you back. I mean, I just think these are stories that we need to tell, and Americans need to hear. So I want to thank you for just your willingness to come on and tell the story, but for living such an enriched life and sharing it with us. What a great story. So thank you.
And I do want to let you know that fortunately, my dad has written his experience down, and it's a book called Free Behind Bars.
Wow.
By Leonardo Cabrera.
Okay, I'll tell you what. If you can people buy that book? Can they get a hold of it?
Yes, they can. It's on Amazon.
It's on Amazon. Okay. The other thing is, if you'll send me the link to that, I'll make sure that we put that in the podcast, the link to the podcast, so people can see that and do it. I'm going to go order it and read it. I'm excited to do that. That's just such a great, what a hero. I mean, your father was such a great example, I think, to you throughout your whole life. What a great story. And thanks for sharing it with us.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. It's my pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Grace. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
You bet. So I would just say this again, there are people who risk their lives in shark-infested water. They build rafts and try and float to this country, to the United States of America. And at the same time, we have people who take all of that for granted, just the little things, turning on a water faucet and having water come out of it, let alone hot water, as Grace talked about. But think about freedom of speech. Think about freedom of religion. All of those guarantees, the Second Amendment, the right to due process, all of the rights, individual rights that are embodied in that Bill of Rights that protect each of us. We take them for granted. We take them for granted, and we shouldn't do that. And it's people like Grace and her dad and these stories that remind us how great this country is and how precious liberty and freedom is. And it's only a breath away from extinction. We have to pass that on to future generations. It's important that we do that. So thanks again to Grace for sharing her story and her father's story. Go get that book, read that book. I'm sure it's just incredible. I'm looking forward to reading that. And thank you for joining us on another edition of American Potential.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.